Thank you,
Our next speaker is Amanda Holt, a citizen redistricting specialist who has devoted much more than the average amount of time to this subject. Amanda, if you would summarize the key points of your testimony, and then we will turn to the questions. But welcome again to the Senate State Government Committee.
Don't know that I've put 2,500 hours in, but I have put in 10 years on this. And I guess my summary would be that I don't think you should divide municipalities in drawing congressional districts. I'm not here necessarily to advocate for a particular configuration, but ask that you would consider keeping every municipality, other than, of course, Philadelphia, which exceeds the size of a congressional district whole. And the maps that I provided here show how that is possible to be done, even with a very small population variance. And then earlier this morning or late last night, I provided some additional information that explains why I believe, based on past court decisions, both in the Middle Court of Pennsylvania and the U.S. Supreme Court, why the population ranges that I'm suggesting here would be allowable in order to keep municipalities whole. So I could go on, but I'm happy to leave my summary there and start on questions if you have any questions for me.
Let me start with the issue of causality. I spent a lot of time on what causes what in grad school. What brought you to this process? Why did you choose to volunteer to devote so many hours of your life to this rather unique endeavor?
It was the congressional districts in 2003, probably. I live in Lehigh County, and in 2003, one voting precinct in Lehigh County, which consisted of maybe 2,000 people or so, was taken out of Lehigh County and that congressional district and put with a different congressional district. And it happened to be in my township. I didn't live in that particular voting precinct. And I looked at that and I saw that the districts, the two districts that then covered Lehigh County, both shared people that lived in other counties. And I'm a puzzler. I love to do puzzles. And I looked at that and I thought, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just switch out the people that are already shared in other parts of the state and not, keep Lehigh County whole? So asking that why question caused me to get interested, and I couldn't find a good answer. And I thought, well, I need to speak up about this. And so I started to learn more about it and share what I was learning with people like you who are making these decisions. And I have a great deal of persistence, apparently, because here I am 10 years later still talking about it.
You've chosen to place maintaining counties and municipal boundaries, to protect those, as a much higher goal than many of the other groups that are involved in this. Why do you believe that should be a higher goal than any of the other factors?
I think that it's a long-standing value in Pennsylvania, right? It's been something that's been talked about as it relates to redistricting, not specifically congressional redistricting, because congressional redistricting hasn't been covered in our Constitution, but it's been a value since the founding of Pennsylvania that's been talked about. And until the 1960s, counties were not divided and forming congressional districts until it became apparent that, wait a minute, this is causing significant discrimination against minorities. We need to have some kind of balance. You can't have districts that are like 200,000 people apart in size. That's just crazy. And so there was found a need to become some kind of balance. You can't just look at one thing to the exclusion of everything else. And so I feel like those boundaries are what are used to make a lot of governmental decisions, and these are governmental districts. I mean, we live in towns that determine what our taxes are going to be, what our education's going to look like, transportation needs. All of those things filter through these small building blocks that begin as the towns and the other municipalities where we live, and then it grows up from there into, counties and then into the whole state. And so using those communication pathways, if you will, to form the building blocks of districts, I think is important to do, because it is a unifying, and they don't change either. The boundary lines of counties and municipalities have not changed and do not change very regularly. So they're fixed and so provide a limit. If you read the Constitutional Convention of 1968, when they were discussing, in light of all of these court cases, how could they limit gerrymandering, and all of those minds that got together and debated, maybe for 2,500 hours or whatever, that they wondered what could they do differently. And they thought that respecting county and municipal boundary lines was a great way to limit gerrymandering in Pennsylvania. And that's why they continue to put that value forward in our Constitution today, and said that this is something that should be respected when forming districts.
And many of us, perhaps all of us, support the concept of communities of interest, but it's much easier to draw a boundary line, say we know this is where the line is between Schuylkill County and Carbon County. There is no doubt about this. When you're drawing boundary lines for communities of interest, it gets much dicier. Is that why your maps, unlike the previous map that we looked at, maintains the territorial integrity, to use a term, of the city of Pittsburgh?
Yes, I mean, if I'm trying to keep every municipality whole and then split Pittsburgh, I haven't kept every municipality whole. So it is important to be consistent when you're applying the rule. If you're saying this is what you're going to do, you have to follow through and actually do that. And once you decide that, well, you can start making exceptions to the rule and say, okay, now I get to pick and choose which municipalities remain whole and which ones don't. Now you are all of a sudden getting to make judgment calls. And so the idea is here that you're universally applying this to all municipalities, except, like I said, Philadelphia. And so they're all equally benefiting from having that value in place in the maps.
Okay, thank you. Senator Street.
Obviously, this is a logical way of doing it. Can you tell us some of the pros and cons of where your maps landed with respect to diversity, competitiveness, compactness, as compared to maps that were done prioritizing other things?
So I didn't look at competitiveness at all, so I can't really speak to that. The minority issue is extremely important to me. So I did look at that. There are stats here that mention how it does provide for one majority minority district as well as one coalition district in Philadelphia. I also considered, I think it was in version 2, what would happen if you put the two largest Hispanic areas outside of Philadelphia in the same district, which are the city of Allentown and Reading, and what might that look like. And I think that ended up being close to like 20% Hispanic when I did that, while still respecting the other values. Other parts of the state really didn't have areas that were sufficient minority size to do anything. I'd also considered whether or not is it better to have one minority in Philadelphia, for instance. You could have two districts that had about like 40% or so Black population in them. Is that more desirable than having one at 50% and like another one at 30%? These, I ended up going with the 50% in one and 30% in the other. So those are some things I considered and looked at. The compactness scores would probably come in, I don't know, they were comparable maybe to what you would see in other maps. I could get you those numbers if you need them. Because it depends once again on what compactness score you end up using. So I guess compactness can be in the eye of the beholder too. So it depends on what kind of metric you want to use, because the counties and municipalities themselves are not always compact. And so compactness scores can suffer when you end up keeping places whole. So those were some of the other things that I considered as far as the metrics you mentioned. I mean, you can think about two school districts or something I looked at as another kind of community of whether you could keep those whole or not. But when you're trying to get down to really low deviations and not split your municipality, it can be a little challenging to consider too many things in great specificity.
Okay. Final question of this. So your map, obviously with Philadelphia, doesn't look that different than some of the other maps. But on the on Pittsburgh, can you tell a little bit? I guess expound a little bit more of what did that do to the region versus splitting it? And I've heard strong arguments both ways on that, and I will come up saying I have no preconceived notion about what we should or shouldn't do out there. Just interested in hearing your thoughts on that. Because by the way, I have heard many Pittsburghers who don't think we should split Pittsburgh, and I've heard some that say we should.
I think Pittsburgh should remain in one district. I think that if you're going to keep every municipality whole, if it can remain whole, you should keep Pittsburgh wholly in one district. To say that, by splitting Pittsburgh, maybe, part of Pittsburgh shares more in common with another area, some of the suburbs, than another. I think, the entire city of Pittsburgh has the same mayor, for instance. There's a lot that they share in common. They have the same, tax structure, transportation needs, all these things that they would be wanting to advocate for. And by dividing them, you're just reducing their voice in their legislative district. So I think that it should remain whole. How you put Pittsburgh within Allegheny County, and what, obviously it can't just be a district by itself, so you have to put it with some of the suburbs, and how that happens. There are different ways you could do that. You could, put it more to the north. You could put it more to the south. There were different ways. If you look at the different maps that I put in here, there are different configurations how you could, pull that together. But I think it's important that Pittsburgh stay within one district.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Senator Dush, followed by Senator Laughlin.
Thank you, Chairman. Amanda, you're an inspiration. The things and the changes that you brought as a result of your active stance in this, thank you for it. The people are free here in America to move to wherever they want. And most of the time when they're talking with the realtors, they're talking about the local governments, the school districts, that sort of thing. And it's a key element of where they're choosing to live. And I think you've hit it on the fact that the municipal government should be the key and the primary driver on whether or what not to split, and in drawing these. And I think the courts have overstepped in a lot of ways. I agree with both testifiers today. I think when the census was going on last year, we were, because of COVID, my rural area of Pennsylvania, I have 1 out of every 7 square miles in the Commonwealth. We'd never seen competition and bidding wars on properties like we've seen during COVID. People are moving out of some of the urban areas and into our, moving up into our area. So the census numbers I know are off, even before they got published. So having the types of deviations that both groups are recognizing, the courts have gone too far with that. I think in keeping the communities together, the boundaries of the municipal governments, I think, are key. Can you speak to, when you were trying to draw the maps, were there things that you recognize, because you've been doing this with the 2000 and the early 2003, I think it was, you were saying that you started looking at this, or the 2003 map. What kind of changes did you see, and with the impacts on the communities over those decades. Did you see anything that would lead you to, I guess what I'm trying to say is, how tightly should we be looking at the numbers? I agree with you. In 1968, when they were talking about keeping the counties whole, I mean, sometimes counties had districts. There were changes. Can you talk to some of that?
You're talking about how closely do I think you need to adhere to zero? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Informing all of this? I think the courts have been pretty clear, and I talk about this some in my testimony, that you have to make an effort to get to zero, right? You can't just,
Right.
There's no like safe harbor where if you reach a certain number, they're going to be, oh, that's fine, you know? And sometimes getting as close to zero in West Virginia was reaching, 4,000 person variance, and other places, like in Pennsylvania, when they didn't make an effort to get to zero, 19 persons was a problem. So I think you have to make an effort to get to zero, but I think it's clear, like in the Karcher decision, they talk about how you don't have to focus on just one thing. So you can be balancing many different things, and they put forward several neutral criteria that can be considered. So I'm suggesting, obviously municipalities and reducing splits in counties as one consideration. But for instance, like compactness would improve if you went from the 13 person I showed up to, I think I had one here for 26, and that would make more compact districts. So if you were making that a priority as well, then, a higher deviation might be allowable because of you trying to balance these multiple priorities. It's something they talked about in the West Virginia case in 2012, was that they were looking to, West Virginia hadn't just done better on limiting splits, because that was one of the issues that came up, but they talked about how the map did better on many different fronts. And one of the problems with the Pennsylvania map in 2000 is it failed on absolutely every neutral front. The court pointed out that it just didn't do anything right. They looked at all the neutral possibilities, not even the ones that Pennsylvania was suggesting as a reason for why they had their variance. And the map failed on every single front. So I think that it is, while you need to make an effort to get to zero deviation, it is fine to have these variances to consider whatever interest you're looking to do. You just have to follow through and actually do what you say you're going to do. You have to be genuine in expressing your interests and not disingenuous. So I think that it is possible to do these sorts of things and have these kind of variances while achieving values that are significant here in Pennsylvania.
Thanks for sorting through my stumbling.
No problem.
Again, I marvel at your interest in this. As I remember as a teaching a class at Penn State Schuylkill campus 20 years ago, before the advent of a lot of the computer technology, I gave an assignment to my students that was due in a week of just to redistrict, I think, one county into three pieces with essentially a sheet of data, a calculator, and colored pencils. They hated it so much that they begged me never to do that assignment again. So understand, this isn't for everyone, but thank you. Thankfully, there are people like you across the state who take this task on. Senator Laughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amanda, thank you for being here today. I want to say that I really appreciate your passion for this. I truly think it's very impressive. I do have a couple things that I'd like to discuss with you, and I think we have a few differences of opinion here as well that I'd kind of like to air out a little bit. As far as compactness goes, I'm looking at the map that was the citizens map here, and it's not that I don't think compactness should be at least part of the equation, right? But I'm looking at Glenn Thompson's current congressional district, at least on this map, and it encompasses 15 counties. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure whose congressional district it is in Philadelphia that's small enough that he could probably walk the boundary of it. So compactness, at least in my opinion, is probably, the least of our concerns. And I've been in the legislature for 5 years now. And, granted as a state senator, not as a congressman, but I think there's a lot of similarities at least. And I think the one thing that I take exception with, respectfully, is that you said you really didn't look at competitiveness that much, or I think you said at all. And I can tell you from my 5 years in the Senate now that the districts that I feel are best represented are in the districts that are very competitive, where the legislator has to truly consider all of their constituents and they're not in a safe district. I'm not going to give any specific examples here, although I think we can all bring them to mind on the federal level. Some of the people that are in safe districts that have been in the legislature for 30 or 40 years and have never had to worry about winning their seat are some of the worst examples of our representative government. And I think that's my biggest difference of opinion with you. I will say that I think that the changes that we are making about drawing the maps out in the open and having public involvement are very important. I think that is probably the single greatest thing that's going to come out of this. And that's really about all I had to throw in. I just wanted you to think about the competitiveness as you move forward with this stuff. And if you want to respond, that's fine. If not, that's okay too.
I think if you all, competitiveness is not something that's ever been covered in our Constitution. It's not been a value put forward. And competitiveness gets into thinking about the partisan makeup of a district, right? And that has been an issue that's come out a lot in courts. So the question is how much, once you start to consider the political makeup of districts, right, there can be intentional, or there can be, you can be considered to perhaps drawing districts to favor particular political parties or disfavor other political parties. And that gets to be a very sticky question, and one that the U.S. Supreme Court has found difficult to decide upon. And so in trying to draw maps that perhaps focus more on neutral criteria, sometimes this competitive issue, what does it really mean to be competitive? I mean, can you draw, like there are certain parts of the state here in Pennsylvania which just geographically are not competitive, right? Whether they're in urban areas or whether they're in rural areas. And so it's a challenging question to consider. If it's something that the Senate wishes and the legislature wishes to have as a value in the maps, it's certainly something that could be drawn. You could work to draw districts that are competitive, which respect municipalities. I'm not suggesting that, it's something that couldn't be considered in context of this. But then the question is, if you have two competing values, right? If you have two maps and one's a little more competitive and splits municipalities and the one's a little less competitive and doesn't split municipalities, which value is going to prevail, I guess, if you will? And I'm suggesting that don't split municipalities, even if it means that districts are a little less competitive, if they're a little less compact, that you keep municipalities whole.
No, and I appreciate your input on that. I think we just have a difference of opinion on it, clearly. As someone who comes from a county that used to be split before the courts stepped in a few years ago, I have a little bit different take on that as well, and I see that Allegheny County in this map is split, okay? Everybody is represented by a congressman, whether you like the district or not, and there's just a different line of thought on that as well. Like Erie County is, I would say, if you polled everyone in Erie County, they're happy that they are now in one congressional district. But actually, having two congressional members represent your county can actually provide a little bit more muscle, if you will, in the process. Now, it's not to say who likes which one or any of that. I'm not going to get into that here. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think the not splitting of counties, not municipalities. I can totally appreciate that. But as far as not splitting counties, I don't think that should be really that much of a concern. I guess that's all. So anyway, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Laughlin. I think to your point as well as to Senator Streets, it occurred to me that, you know, and this whole issue about voting behavior, proportionality, is additionally, I think, challenging in this time because we're drawing lines for 10 years. And we've certainly seen those proportions and those voting behaviors change pretty radically in the last 10 years. Upstate and in rural communities, we have communities that were once considered, pretty hardcore Democrat voting Republican. In suburban areas, we see exactly the opposite. And so if we were to try to attempt to honor those, we'll call them a community of interest, that could change pretty significantly over the 10 years. And so I've said it many times that the experts have been proven wrong in gerrymandering time after time after time again when their goal is this, but the voters get the last say. And so just interesting how different people are going to bring different values to this, and understand why you chose to focus on A rather than B. It also occurred to me in looking at your second map, again, looking at the communities closest to where I live, in the 9th Congressional District, you were able to put the puzzle pieces together in such a way that you did not divide one single county in that 9th District. At the same time, you were able to reunite Berks County for the first time in 20 years. And Senator Laughlin, to your point, they've had that argument in Berks County. Is it better to have multiple voices in Congress, or would they prefer to have just one? And I've heard both. What was especially intriguing to me that you were able to do that with an overall deviation of 146 people in a state of 13 million. And so I'm not going to do the math in my head, but I have to think that's a pretty tiny percentage. But the trade-off was you had to split your own county in Lehigh County. And so we come to the point where there is never going to be one perfect map for anyone. But I really do appreciate the effort, and I can only imagine the time that you've devoted to this. Any other questions from members of the committee? If we have any follow-up questions, I know that you've spent a good bit of time with our staff, and we will follow up with you again. But thank you for coming today.
Thank you.